Going to get us started call the meeting to order at 6:03. The only adjustment to the agenda that we have is that there is not a need for an executive session, so we can take that off the agenda. Does anyone else have any adjustments to the agenda? Any audience and communications? Okay. Jen, thank you for coming and attending our meeting. The first presentation tonight is the instructional programming presentation, but before we do that, I just thought it would be really helpful, since we did approve finally the board budget goals, to kind of set the framework for the conversation tonight of what we asked the administration to do. And so it's not as detailed as you recall, but I think you get the highlights that we expect that a budget that is proposed supports the implementation of mission and vision, meets or exceeds EQS, which I think Elaine will go into tonight, implement the key initiatives, that was proficiency-based learning, flexible pathways, those type of things. Implement and continue to improve the budget process, including focus on community input, which Bonnie is all over. Thank you for posting on Front Porch Forum. All at a cost the community will support. And if you remember, we finally settled in on a budget increase of 4.4.
4.4 is the target at the cost per equalized pupil.
Yep.
And we're currently at 3.9 against that target.
Okay, so with that, and keeping that in the back of our heads, Elaine.
Of why we are all employed in here, right?
It was for support.
So, just to put it in context, I'll let you get your packages here. To put it in context, tonight we're talking about the general ed budget, where we already, Megan did a presentation on the special ed budget 2 weeks ago. Jean will follow up with operations later, but tonight we're doing this sliver that's highlighted. General ed, we'll come back to this at the end, but you can see what the impact of what we're doing with general ed salary and benefits accounts for 4.6% of the increase. Everything else accounts for 1.3%. So the agenda is in 4 parts. I will do an overview of the process. How do we put this budget together anyway, including all the principals? And you'll remember last year during the retreat, you said we want to see how staff is better involved in it. So I'll speak to that a little bit. We'll look at the equity and autonomy matrix and see how that informs the work that we do and keeps us focused on making sure that there are educational opportunities, similar educational opportunities across the school district while maintaining the autonomy that we all cherish. And then a focus area on initiatives, both the ones that we're plugging away at all the time and the ones that we think we've enhanced through this budget cycle. And then I'll do a summary going back to the board goals and then what the financial impact is. So process and timeline, basically that is a lot of meetings that happen. And I just want to put in a plug for what I hear Lynn say all the time. It's year-round budgeting. So I'm going to show you 2 process cycles, but they really should be like Fibonacci cycles instead of like just the circular cycle. And that involves instructional planning meetings that we have with the principals. So while there's no beginning and ending here, because really I can guarantee you, we have a principal here, I think she'd agree, that the budget will not even have gone to the voters yet before principals start thinking about next year, right? Because they've got plans out there. So I'm just going to start with the site-based principals meeting that is just at the top there, because that's an important in this whole process, that principals are working with their program councils and their staffs to make sure that they're apprised. And we're going to hear that again. And then that goes to Colt. They let us know. And then back to lead, back to principals. And here in the middle, we have one major meeting at the end of October, beginning of November, where we show up and meet with each of the administrative teams and go over each one of those things with them. And when I say we go over it, I mean like for class size, we say how many kids in each of these grades this year, move them forward, who are the teachers even, if we know that. Obviously, we have retirement, so sometimes there's a blank there, but it's that level of detail that we get into. Essential arts, if there are any changes, what that looks like, the intervention framework, that honestly should have a cycle of its own, and you'll hear from Megan later about that, because that's one that since we've introduced it, just keeps coming back around at our round robin meetings and at our lead meetings. Admin ratios, we look at that time. It's not something that we keep popping up. It's a pretty simple thing. And then the para support in the classrooms. You might remember I did a project last year around that. I'm pleased to tell you that we fixed the inequity that existed. So I can tell you straight out that there is equity in paras, general ed paras, across the district. And last year, you had asked at the retreat, or soon thereafter, that I work on making sure that we do more communication with the staff and involve them more. So we've been working on that this year. Once we have the instructional planning meeting that I just described, so that's at like 2 o'clock there, from that, we issued an invitation to each of the principals to invite either myself and Megan or Jeff. I mean, it hasn't worked out this year. It'll be much better next year. But invite us to go meet with their program councils to go over how this all works, including much of the information I'm going to be sharing with you. We've done 3 of them so far, or 4 of them so far, 2 more to go. So this is why it will be better next year, because by now we should have done all of them. And I think we have one this week, and we have another one next week. So, but that's been really interesting. I mean, we've really heard from people that like they had no idea that there was like a structure to the way we put the budget together. And then the other piece that we've added that I think is really important is after each of these meetings, Bonnie and I and whoever did a presentation, so last time it was Megan and Jean always, sit down and say, what are the key things we want to make sure that our staff knows? And so we developed that list. It's like a, you know, like a kind of a list of like 4 or 5 key points, and we send that to the principals and ask them to share it with their staff. And Bonnie also includes it in the curriculum newsletter that she does. So lots more information, right? And so another piece that plays into it is how does, if a teacher has an idea about something that they want to include in the budget, how does that happen? So we've kind of fine-tuned that a little bit more too. Up until this year, that's been kind of everybody just did their own thing depending on how they used to do it. But now principals solicit input from the staff, they get suggestions, and they do that first cut of what should come forward. So by the time they come to the instructional planning meeting with us, they already know, they've already heard, and they already have an idea what they want to put forward. At the instructional planning meeting, they share with us. And at that meeting, we're not at all doing any, we're not putting rates on anything. We're really saying, what's it look like currently? What do you project it's going to look like? What are the needs that you see? What's missing that would either enhance the program or that would allow you to do what you need to do? So, and we don't say no to any of that. We need to roll up all the numbers. And then if the numbers were, you know, very much like student services, student service planning meetings, if the number's too high, then they come up and say, well, we need to find that. And then that would be another whole cycle and a collective effort. This year, for the first time, I got some district decision packets. I actually got one formal, And that was for a diversity coordinator, equity, literacy, / diversity coordinator. And I had somebody else call me about another one. They said, how would we do this? So Holt developed a process that includes you submit it to me, we review it at Colt, we review it at Lead, and then make a determination. So there's that kind of process. But this is the first time that teachers have started saying, wait a minute, how do we put in for something that we think would be important for the district if it's not at the local level? And so we developed a process for that. Chapter 2, equity and autonomy. So when we're looking at equity and autonomy, we look at the framework. So we don't just start from scratch. We had, you probably remember, we developed in the first year of merger this huge equity and autonomy matrix. Megan, maybe you can flash that up there. So this is a huge spreadsheet, and you can see that there are all kinds of tabs along the bottom. Jean manages this. She keeps track of these ratios. Every single person who works for us in the instructional part of our mission is tagged with this. We normalize the numbers so that we can compare apples and oranges. And from this we can see, we can get ratios, and we can make comparisons across, and we can scroll all the way down and see what it looks like bottom line, and we can look within divisions. So this is the table that we used when we were doing the intervention framework. It is also the spreadsheet that we used when I was doing all the work on essential arts last year. So over time, I would say, and we had this conversation just Monday, this is the source document. Like more and more, every time we develop, I develop tables, I get teased about it a little bit, but I develop tables. If you develop a table or another spreadsheet, we're going to link it to this, because this is the document that frames all of it. I see a hand up here.
Yeah, I would love to look at this a little more closely. I don't know where to find it, and I can't see it from here.
Yeah, so you wouldn't find it. Basically, I wanted to put it up there so that you could see that we have a way to do this. It is not a budget document. Remember, I said we normalize the numbers so that there is no part of this, no part of seniority that plays into what your numbers are. It is straight FTE. And I'd like to have more conversation about whether or not we would put that out publicly. It really is a working document for us. Mostly tonight, I want you to know that we're not just each time starting from scratch. We really have all of the people there. It's like deep into the numbers. Thank you, Megan. So, and then we'll talk about class size, the essential arts, the intervention framework. I'll let Megan and Jeff take that, and programmatic opportunities, and I'll let Jeff take that. Because I know I'm guilty of starting to talk and I do the whole thing, but the truth is, I have partners here who do most of the work. So I want to make sure that you hear their voices when we get to those parts. So we saw that. So here are the class size ratios. I want you to know these are all FY21 numbers. Later when we say, oh, we added this or whatever, you are seeing the final results. You're seeing what we're proposing. That we're saying this is our best offer of an excellent program for you guys for next year. So at kindergarten, the average across the district would be 18.3. The range is 17 to 19. That is pretty good equity. Very different from last year, by the way. And the average EQS has to be less than 20, right? K through 3, the CVSD average is a little bit higher. And the range, though, is still pretty narrow, and it's under 20. 4 through 8, I'll just quickly jump over to the average for EQS is under 25, and we definitely are in there. And again, the range is pretty narrow. These are real numbers moved forward, except for kindergarten. And honestly, kindergarten, you know, we've done a couple things. We start registration earlier than we ever have. So in some schools, they've already started reaching out. And Shelley Henson has also reached out to all our partner programs, so we do have a sense. That's why I have confidence in the numbers that I've got up there. But they could change, right? Those are the numbers that are hard. There are two numbers. I'm going to say the same thing again when we get to 9th grade. Squirrely numbers, we don't have a handle on it. We know we're going to get more than what we think we're going to get, but how much is, hard to tell. So here's equity, autonomy, and class size across. So now you can see what it looks like in each of our schools. And you can see that it's pretty close. It's a much narrower field than it was last year, for sure. I'm going to leave it there for a second so you can look at that. These are the essential arts ratios. And if you look at the bottom, they are pretty close at the bottom. You'll also notice, and we'll speak to this a little bit more, in order to simultaneously keep it close at the bottom, and we believe provide much greater opportunities for our students. We've also added some tech ed, STEM actually. It's at Charlotte and in Heinsberg. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the end. But that gets the ratios even, yes.
So that
It's
is
already in there.
including- Okay.
It's already, all of this is already in there. And you'll find out what the budgetary impact is at the end.
But
Okay?
this is what it could look like.
This is what we're proposing because we think this is a good budget, good program. I'm going to wait on this because Adam was just here. I might start, but I want to hold any questions for when Adam's here because he can best answer this. I can say class size averages at CVU. This is last 5 years. I can't give you current numbers at CVU the way I can for the elementary schools because it really depends on when they start doing their class selections, and that does not happen until, I don't know, March maybe? You know better. I think it's around March. But those are good numbers. The core number is what's the average size of a core, right? So that is 4 teachers and a group of, depending on the year, 80 to 100 students. These are the CVU averages with and without core. So he averaged all the students. Jean, I think you were going to have a conversation with Adam. Did he talk to you about this or not? These are the numbers. So if you factor in the core, that's the difference. And I think the thing to notice there is it's not much different, right? Whether you add the core or not does not substantially change what the average class size is for English, social studies, math, or science.
And I think the reason this used to be, CVU board chair hat on, is that it used to be a pretty big discrepancy. We had class sizes of 20 or 21 in the core and 24 or 25 not in the core, but when you added them together, it was hard to demonstrate that 24 was too many for a math class because it was all, it got averaged down too much. So we started separating it out to have 2 different discussions, but now they're getting much closer.
What is interesting is that in the core this year, there's one set of classes where some kids have 8 and some kids have 25.
Depending on the class.
Depending on the class, in the core. So I'm not talking electives or anything like that. And it has to do with 4 things taken,
Math.
5 things taken 4 at a time, right? Because there's 2 different math classes that they could be at. And I find it interesting that my daughter's science class is 8.
Right.
And the other section is much bigger. It's well over 20.
Right. And is that just a function of the schedule, or is that a function of what science class it is?
It's a function of the challenge of scheduling math, which is
Right.
the different maths they have to take within the core. And so
Right.
math really drives the scheduling, because you have to have certain kids grouped together for certain math courses. So that impacts the schedule. Having taught core for many years, that is the biggest challenge.
Yeah. And what would be cool to see, like, is that range.
Oh.
Because it works well, and everybody always says, small classes don't necessarily make a difference.
Yeah.
Big classes don't make a difference. So it's interesting getting a 14-year-old's perspective on small class size.
Yeah, so range within the core.
She does not.
Does world language also have that same impact? Because our kids move into the high school and some test in for like French or Spanish too, and others don't.
Well, world languages are
They're
outside
outside
the
the
core,
core.
so it's not, it doesn't have the same impact.
So class size averages for other areas. Again, it's a pretty narrow range. Some of them that are smaller, for instance, family and consumer science and tech ed, there are safety reasons why those would be smaller, but other than that, the range is pretty narrow. So CVU, number of students per full-time teacher. So what the EQS says is that teachers should not have more than 100 students on their roll. So in a way, the EQS doesn't match the information that I'm providing here, and I don't know the answer to that information. When Adam comes, we can ask him. I'm not sure if he even knows. But what this is saying is that, for example, ninth grade core, there are 20 sections that are between 20 and 100. Not surprising, right? Right. Because it's the core, and if there are more than 75 kids in the core, then it's all going to be that. But if you look at core academics, there are 6 sections that are between, 6 of the sections are between 75 and 100, 15 are between 101 and 120, and 5 are over 120. Sections, not teachers. So that's why it doesn't really match what EQS is measuring, but it gives you a sense of what it looks like.
Molly?
Yep.
Sorry, so is core academics, that we're
That's
talking about for
grades 10
10th,
through
11th,
12.
and 12th?
10 through 12.
10 through 12, okay.
The academic, the core
Yeah.
academic sections.
You define sections, using the word sections.
A class,
Yeah, class.
a single class.
Yeah.
Yep.
And are those 5 that are over 120, are those all like AP classes, or do we know what those are?
Let me see if I have a slide.
You know, and I think this is a comeback, because I'm a little confused myself.
Yeah.
There's no sections out of 120 kids in them. So I'm a little confused as to what he's trying to say. But so I'll take that.
When he goes, yeah.
I think it's teachers who
Yeah.
see over 120
Yeah,
kids,
that's what makes
whereas
sense.
EQS is
Yeah, it's teachers
Well-
who have more than 120.
not at one time,
Right.
but over the,
Right.
And if that's the case, we need to confirm that with Adam, but if that's the case, then we have a number of teachers who are over what the EQS is.
But so last year, we had a follow-up, and I just scrambled,
Right.
I just got on it too late to get with Adam, but it was, he knows, we know exactly which sections and cores it is, and why they're over. Some of them are
Right.
AP courses, some of them are, last year there was one big class that's moving through. That's
And there's
penciled in.
that big class is still moving through.
Right. So, I can take that.
There were 8 last year. This year, we're down to 5, so we must be doing something.
Okay,
Well, we added
we
math
added
and
social studies and math,
But, yeah.
Those teachers.
right, so it's better. This is technical center enrollment. This is also an EQS standard. Lynn mentioned that I'd be mentioning EQS. I am not going to do like 10 slides of each of the areas of EQS, but you notice on your slides, it says if that particular slide is referenced in EQS, and you also have the link to the education quality standards document. So, no, this is Burlington and Essex Tech Center,
And probably total. is what it is.
and total, right.
Yeah, then total.
So the blue is Burlington, the yellow is Essex, and the green is the total number of students that are going to each one of them.
And Elaine, do students have the opportunity to access whichever, whether, if they want
It's
to go to
their
Burlington,
choice.
it's their choice? And
Right.
can they even move back and forth depending upon what the offerings are in the various technical centers?
They wouldn't, in the same year, they wouldn't go to 2 different ones, but they can make that choice. So glad you're here. I'm going to back up the slide for a second and let you speak to it a little bit.
Do we know why our kids tend to go to Essex and not Burlington? Is it just a difference in?
Actually, it's the other way around, isn't it? Oh, no, it is Essex. Yeah. Do we know that? Why more students choose Essex than?
You know, Essex has a full-day offering and a broader array of choices for students.
So Adam, we were looking at this slide, and we're thinking that it means there are 5 teachers who have over 120 students
Yes.
in a class.
Yeah.
Do we know what those classes are?
I can dig into it.
And we did notice that that the number of sections decreased, the number of teachers who have over 120 students decreased this year from last
It
year.
did, yeah, quite a
Because
bit. It was primarily mathematics in the
Right.
past few years, so things like AP stats, those types
Right.
of classes tend to have more students enrolled.
Okay, I'll let you look at that. So the education quality standard around this is that we must make it available, we must let students know that it's available, and we must provide them like with the kind of career readiness information in case that's something that they want to do. Yeah.
Is there a bus here for the Burlington Half Day kids?
Do we have a bus for the Burlington Half Day Kids?
We do.
So now we're getting into deep education quality standards stuff. So library media, education quality standards says that you should have, if you have a school of 300, you need at least a librarian. So it doesn't say you need one for every 300. It says once you have 300 kids in your school, you need a full-time librarian. So here are what it looks like across for us. The one that sticks out there is Shelburne, and we're only counting the librarian. In Shelburne, they have a full-time library media specialist para. So those are choices that people make, and since we don't see that it makes a difference, we look at that as the autonomy piece, right? But we didn't count that. If we were to count that other person, obviously that number would change significantly. Nursing is 1 to 500, and you can see we're right on the money right across the board on that one. Counseling is 1 to 300 at the elementary level, 1 to 200 at the high school level, and the EQS includes in that figure homeschool coordinators, social workers, SAPs, as well as school counselors. So all of those were factored in. Into the EQS, and those are our numbers across the top, and they're pretty even across the board. Administration says if you have 10, it's similar to a couple of the other ones. If you have 10 full-time faculty, you need a full-time principal. And then you need as many more to allow the principal to, do supervision, be an instructional leader. They list kind of the role description of a principal and say, this is how many you need. After the 1, you need enough to make sure that the principal can do those kind of leadership roles. And there's the link to the education quality standards.
Just on that bottom row, the top row of numbers is admin to students, and the next one's admin to faculty.
Oh, right, for administration.
Right,
And
for
that's
district
based on
administration.
EQS. Yep. Okay. I'm just going to let Jeff speak a little bit here about education quality standards because he lives in that world more than any of the rest of us. In terms of, I'm doing the number crunches because that's part of the EQS. But the really important part of the new education quality standards, I revised in 2014 or 15, I think, was that instead of focusing on those input measures, how many of this per this, the document really is focused on output measures. What are you going to get? That's the more important piece, right? And so it talks a lot about continuous improvement plans, personalized learning plans, flexibility, curriculum coordination, comprehensive assessment plan, the world that he lives in. I don't know if there's anything you want to mention.
You nailed all of them. I would say that
That also some things that have influenced too is the PICA study that came out a while back as well.
Right.
So in conjunction with the EQS, we look at something done, I don't know how long ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years
Yeah.
ago. It's called the PICA study that talks about how to adequately fund resources within school districts. And that's provided us some guidance about some things that EQS doesn't address, like instructional coaches, for instance, like digital learning leaders. So that has worked in conjunction with EQS in terms of guidance for us.
I think that's a really good point, Jeff, and it plays its way in lots of areas. So when we get to the next to the last slide, I think, and we say, like, here are the changes that are represented in this proposed budget, there are a lot of moving parts that are still going on that relate exactly to what Jeff was just saying. Always we're looking at, how could we do this better? What might be a better way to configure this, that, or the other thing? And that's complicated because we deal with real-life human beings who work for us. And it's not, you can't just say, oh, we'll just take you now and you're doing this and we'll have you do this over here. So if we make a big, broad change and we don't give ourselves enough time to allow the change to occur, we're really discombobulating the system. So that's always at play. And the PICUS study really gets at that. You know, like there could be things that we've been doing forever that aren't the most effective or efficient way of doing business. But you can't just turn on a dime. You have to look at it. And so that's always in conversation. That's another example of its year-round budgeting. Any questions about this? Yes.
I just wonder if it would be helpful in our documents if we reference that report.
Yeah.
So that our reference documents are the EQS,
Yes.
the PICUS study, and so forth.
That's a great idea.
Just to show that we're just not making things up out of thin air.
Yeah, yeah.
In the DMG report.
Yep, I like that. Because that is the truth. We're not making it up. We
Right.
really are kind of deep into all of this stuff and saying what would be best. And we're
Yeah.
having that conversation with the principals and then with ourselves, individual principal groups with ourselves, and then the broader principal group. So it goes around.
Yeah, and then if there are any other key documents such
Yeah.
as leadership, administration, what's the current
Yeah.
philosophy or
Guiding
protocol
principles,
around
for
leadership.
example. There
Yeah.
are things like that, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Intervention framework, I'm just going to speak to this one slide, and then I'm going to let Megan and Jeff walk you through the next slides. You might remember that I think 3 years ago now? I think so. 3 years ago, Megan, Jeff, and I locked ourselves in a room and said, let's figure this part of the equity autonomy matrix out. And honestly, we had 3 whiteboards just filled with stuff, and finally we went like, we need names to be able to even understand. And from that, we started, an organizational structure presented itself. It kind of like popped out of those boards. And what that was is that all the work that we do in this part of our work, the intervention framework, really there are 3 main areas that we hope result in student well-being and proficiency. And those are coaching and coordination of whatever intervention area we're talking about. Implementation, so kind of leading the work. Implementation directly with students. And then like a whole social and emotional learning support that undergirds all of it so that kids are available for the learning and that we have like a culture of learning in our schools. So I would say this is the area that like gets moved around, cycled around the most in all of the work that we do.
So I'll start. Jeff, you can jump in. So we've shown you basically a version of this chart for the past couple of years. That top row is the percentage of K-8 enrollment. So CCS has roughly 14% of our K-8 enrollment and across the board. And so the goal is that this bottom line number is that if you are roughly 14% of the student body, you have roughly 14% of our intervention resources. And remember, the first year we did this, those numbers at the bottom looked very different, and they didn't necessarily align. So some of the biggest takeaways is we're not perfectly in alignment on the bottom, but we're pretty close. We don't have a school drastically using more resources than others. And we'll talk about where there is discrepancy and why that is. And the other way that we look at, so we look at bottom line equity, but we also look at each of our systems touching those 3 essential elements of the intervention framework. And in the beginning, the bottom percentage might have been reasonable, but they were not touching all three of them, or they were touching some disproportionately. So they had a lot of implementers and not very many people coordinating or coaching, or vice versa, and it kind of depended on the school. So over time, those numbers have started to become, have started to come into alignment. And you can kind of see that, so there's 2 years on this. There's the current year that we're in, FY20, and then there's what folks are proposing for the following year in each section.
Which could change.
And it could change, exactly. This is one of those documents that we work on all year long with admin teams. And because it's a closed system, meaning you can make changes within this, it doesn't always have to be a conversation that finishes during budget season unless there's a point at which we need additional resources, which we think that the budget we're presenting has the resources we need baked in to be able to do that. Jeff, oh, and
So the percentage of resources utilized for Charlotte and Williston, it looks like that's going to go down somewhat next year. Will you be speaking concretely to what that means in terms of, will there be fewer resources in those schools?
Good question. First, one is a reminder that this is based on that equity autonomy matrix, which is not a budget document. So there aren't actually dollars moving around. And the second part is not necessarily will there be fewer resources. And that has to do with sometimes the shifts in percentages are only shifting because, so for example, if Heinsberg had, well, Charlotte is going to have less coaching, that's going to make, and we'll explain that specific piece in a second, but that makes all the other percentages go up or down based on changes. So in a way, and later on when we look at the social emotional, you'll see there's actually additional resources in these schools. So it's a little confusing why the percentages change, even though there will be more resources. And I hope that becomes clearer when I show the next slide. If it doesn't, you can ask it again.
Yeah, the fact that Heinsberg is going from 22% last year to 23% means there's going to be a reduction in a couple of the other schools.
Right.
And we can speak to one of the reasons why we feel okay that the Heinsberg has the number they have based on some of the dynamics they face that are unusual.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a good example. That 25 to 20, there is actually no FTE change in Charlotte in coordinating and coaching, but the percentage changes.
But Heinsberg is getting more Title I resources.
Right, yeah, which I'll talk
Exactly.
about in a minute.
Yep. Aaron?
2 questions.
Yep.
So again, this coaching and coordinating line is instructional coaches like Stan and Emily and Monica, not just behavioral.
Correct.
It's also, it's,
That is not behavioral.
Okay.
Right,
So
in-
instructional.
behavioral are captured in the SEL.
Okay.
So it's, but it's lit coordinators, math coordinators,
Okay.
or instructional coaches. Before the consolidation, schools had varying applications of those roles.
Yep.
And I will say that in some schools, the line between coordinating, coaching, and implementing is pretty blurred because they also work one-on-one with a lot of students who are doing implementing. And so that is one of the areas where, since consolidation, we haven't moved the needle a lot in having more common practices, and we've allowed some autonomy. We do feel some things have become more common.
That
but
was
it-
my next question. What is the distinction between or an example of coordinating, coaching versus implementing?
So a lit coordinator, for instance, would coordinate all of the para specialists who are, or paras who are working with students in pull-out services or push-in services. So the coordinator would work out all the schedules for all the kids who need all these things with all the teams and the teaching teams. So they'd be coordinating that. They'd be leading some professional development, which is similar to what an instructional coach might do. And they coordinate all of the assessment system as well, the many assessments that you take in the early grades. Instructional coaching, you would not have to manage people providing interventions, for instance. You'd be doing coaching cycles with teachers in the classroom, doing a lot of professional development, and so there are some distinctions. And implementing is working one-on-one with kids, or small group. Yeah.
And one of the things we've highlighted with implementation before, which isn't really captured here in percentages, is one of our core values in our intervention framework is that implementation needs to rely heavily on the use of professionals as opposed to support staff in terms of who's directly working with kids. So some of the changes that happen in buildings don't show up here because it's a shifted resource from paraprofessionals to professionals. Okay. So this is that segment of social emotional learning, and this is also connected to the EQS number, particularly around what EQS refers to as school counseling. This is a breakout of those, who's baked into that number. So that behavior coach, that 1.0 across the board, I talked a little bit about this in my presentation as it pertains to Medicaid funding. We are in this budget for next year ensuring that all schools, all of our K-8 schools, and the high school has this position as well, but this is just K-8 here, has a behavior coach. Titles vary a little bit, but the key is there is a professional in the budget for next year. In every building, there's a professional who will oversee the social emotional learning component of their system. Everyone has some number of planning room directors and what we term safe harbor specialists. Safe harbor right now is a loose term. We'll land on a district-wide way to refer to this, but these are folks that oversee the part of our system that wraps around kids who are really struggling behaviorally, but don't need a different placement yet. But they need something in between temporarily while someone helps untangle what their program looks like. So you can see variability in planning room directors versus safe harbor specialists in terms of how schools opt to do that. Williston has more planning room folks and fewer safe harbor specialists. But part of the rationale for having that behavior coach position in every building is so that we can start to create programs that look consistent in that area. School psychologists, those are resources that are distributed centrally. I talked about that in the special ed budget. It is a combination of proportionate and as need arises with school psychologists. So they work as a team. They're allocated by population, but when one school needs a certain kind of expertise, they kind of rotate around. School social workers, so these bottom three, though these numbers together is what makes up this ratio. So just so that you know, that's what EQS looks for. So you know this as of last year. Currently we have school social work position half-time in Charlotte that didn't exist before. So all of our buildings have school social work contracts through the Howard Center, as does the high school. That's how many school counselors we have. So just the school counseling position and then SAPs on that bottom row. And you'll notice in Charlotte and Williston, currently they have each about a half-time SAP. One is actually 0.6, but roughly half-time. And given the size of the schools, that doesn't feel proportionate to us. So in this budget that you're seeing, there's an additional, a total additional extra SAP of 1.0 for the district, which is distributed that way. So the two biggest schools will each have a 1.0, and the two smallest schools will maintain their half-time. Erin?
I noticed a little bit of a discrepancy there in the Williston behavior supports between the coach, the planning room director, and the specialist.
Yep.
Total FTE versus our percentage of the population. Are there concerns about that at all in Williston?
So currently what they have at this moment is less than this actually, because they only have a half-time professional that would be in that behavior coach position. So right now the add to their system is the professional in a way to help them decide how they should be distributing resources underneath. So I think to some extent that question, our desire is that that question is answered by having some experts at the table to help them work on that. It also has to do with this safe harbor part of our systems is new, and for some schools it's really new. So some schools have been working on that structure for a couple of years, and they have, when they originally built it, there weren't any, because specialists in our system are support staff, highly trained ones, but they are support staff. And originally, not a lot of schools had specialists But over time, they've discovered that that's really helpful for the professional in that program to have someone to be able to deploy. So Williston may come to that conclusion as well, that maybe we don't need 3 planning room directors, maybe we need a safe harbor specialists. Williston also, I would say, one of the restructuring conversations they're having right now is they have Stride, which is a therapeutic classroom, that currently serves a very small amount of kids. And one of the things that they are doing is using those experts in that program to function a little bit more outside of their program to consult and coach. So in other words, there's resources that may be addressing some of those.
That aren't on this
That aren't on this slide, exactly.
Because
Because
they're
those
special ed?
sit, because they're all funded in special ed. Stride all sits in the special ed budget. Colleen?
It's unclear to me if this is current or next year, and it would just, for me, it would be very helpful to have at least 2 years data.
Yep. This is this year, but then we'll take a.
Yeah,
okay.
it's, for
I
me,
hear
it's
you.
out of context. I don't see how it sits in the
Sorry,
total.
next year.
This is for FY '21.
Right, this is what's in the budget currently proposed for next year.
Right, and I heard you mention that there were some changes there, the increase of 0.5 FTE, whatever, in the different areas, and
So you'll see
I
that
can't
at
see
the
it.
end. You'll see at the end, everything that's been added or reduced in one slide.
okay. So I guess it's just an ask for
Yeah.
dates in multiple
Right.
years.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Megan, do school social workers have a cap on the number of students or families they can work with?
So they do, and we are working with our Howard Center partners to make sure we can use our social workers as flexibly as we can and need to use them. They have caseload limits. Howard has been pretty responsive when we talk to them about how important it is for us to have the social workers be able to be deployed as we need them. It's a conversation, quite honestly, we have every year around what are the benefits of partnering with our designated agency to have our social workers, and what are the limitations? And what, conversely, what would be the benefits of having our own, hiring them on staff and having flexibility? The 2 things that always rise to the top, one is there's a lot of benefit to being connected to the designated agency because it opens up a whole realm of community-based supports for families that we don't necessarily have connection to. But the other one, quite frankly, is cost. It is about 50% cheaper to get a social worker through a Howard Center contract than it would be to hire them on staff.
So if we talk about, for example, a 1.0 FTE social worker, if we're comparing that with any of the other FTEs, is it really a reasonable comparison if within this discipline they are limited in terms of how much work essentially they can do in the course of a week?
Yeah, what I would love to do, and I actually meet with the person at Howard who oversees all our social workers, so I can get some of this information from them next week when I meet with them. It does vary. So what I'd like to share with you is their caseload. It's not as rigid as it used to be. So I want to give those numbers to you because I think there's more flexibility to serve more kids than there has been in the past. The other thing I would say is it's part of what, social workers have a very specific job, and it's different than counselors and SAPs. And so caseload sometimes is limited for real reasons. There's only so many you can, they're the ones going and taking the family to doctor's appointments. They're helping the families access services, and there's only so many that you can have on your caseload. So let me get some more information to flesh out that answer, because it's a good question.
I may be taking this too literally, or I don't know. Does Williston face any unique number challenges because of the 2 buildings?
like planning room they have 3
It's a good
planning room
question.
directors? Is it because one is at Allenbrook and 2 are at WCS?
And I actually have a question kind of off of that, just thinking about that there are 30 and a half FTEs up here, and just thinking about the percentage of kiddos at schools. It seems like Williston is about two FTEs short for equity.
So I want to get back to what Megan said, though, that's not on this chart. Williston has 2 standalone programs at Williston and at Williston Central and at Allenbrook that no other school has. And so when we get into that conversation with everybody, mostly the other schools say, we want what they have. And we realize we can't, it's because of their size that they can have that. And part of the conversation is, could we have district-wide programs like that? So the children that are the most needy, Williston has a separate standalone program for them. That's not listed here, so that would be how many FTEs? At least 2 more.
It's 2 teachers and a half-time social worker plus 2 or 3 support staff.
Right.
It's quite a few.
Right, so
Are
this
you
is
talking about
misleading a
Stride?
little bit.
Okay. And the other answer is, none of these positions cross both buildings, which is important in terms of, are we maximizing their time? So the planning room director there's 1 at Allenbrook and there's 2 at WCS. The coaching position right now only really exists at Allenbrook. Part of the ad is to make sure that position can actually cross both. But for example, social worker, there's 1 at Allenbrook and there's 1 at WCS. Counselors, 1 at Allenbrook, 2 at WCS. And SAP works primarily with middle level kids, so that's a WCS only position and would be in all of the other schools that is working primarily grades 5 through 8. Yep, Brennan.
So, as I'm looking through this, this is very separate from the special education budget.
Right.
So if there was a child that had behavior problems or needed a counselor that was on an IEP or otherwise in that special education bucket, the support to support that child would be budgeted in special education and not reflected here.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Not that these folks don't support kids on IEPs, but
Understood,
if they
yep.
have something specific and individualized in their plan, you saw that a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
And you didn't really see it because we try to keep that confidential, but the staffing associated with it is in the special ed budget.
Great, thank you.
I did make the note next year to include that with a little asterisk, right? Because it would give a better picture, especially in a slide like this that is a comparative slide.
Yeah, I think this is a really good slide, but I don't think it paints the picture of the full support network
Right.
that the school has to support children.
Yep.
I'm going to ask about context, and we've identified a need for our kids is social emotional learning. They cannot learn until they feel safe and they're comfortable, and all the other things that every kid needs before learning actually starts or academic learning starts. And I would just ask if, and I know we've gone through cycles of getting input from all sorts of directions, and I'm just wondering if this is satisfying what we're hearing from our administrators about needs in the schools, and if we can connect more with the Howard Center, for example, are those opportunities there, and so forth. And I guess I'm just looking for more context for this particular
Right.
set of
Totally agree. And
FTEs.
what this is the people resources behind a whole lot of systems work that's been happening over the past number of years, and it includes quite a few additions that have stemmed from that work. I do think that it's a good kind of parking lot question as to whether or not the board wants to see a bigger review of that work.
Well, it's hard for me. I've been doing this, looking at budgets for a long time, and I look at that slide, and I have zero context.
Yep. I think the point I'm making is that it may be a good conversation for the board to ask us to come back to you and give you that, which would be more baked into a year-round budgeting conversation not necessarily in this sequence. But we certainly could do a deep dive into some of the structural work we've been doing. We're one school in to a kind of a special round robin that Elaine and I are doing with admin teams to talk specifically about their social emotional learning systems of support, and how they are feeling about this, and how, what's their current, who do they have currently, what are the additional resources that might be coming, what do they need to do to ready themselves to be able to do that. We have a document that it's kind of a guiding principle document to say these are all the components of an effective program. We have information about where schools are in being able to implement that. Everyone kind of has a sense of what they're working on. In other words, there is plenty of context to flesh this out for you, and it's definitely not on this one slide, so I think if that's...
And I would welcome them as a board member, because we're asked to advocate for the budget and let our community know if we need additional resources. Our budget is projected to go up significantly, I would say. I'd say when we hit over 4%, it's going to be a big ask in the community to support that, and so I feel like I need to be able to address all the issues that budget would support, and I feel a little weak in my knowledge on this particular set of issues. Thank you.
To Colleen's point, and clarification for me too, because I'm not so concerned about the 4% or so number of the overall budget. I'm more concerned about the continued exponential growth in mental health services and special needs services, and how to better articulate like where those services are. So I see this slide as kind of an operational piece where you're looking across the district and trying to identify sort of one for one and equalize people in that manner. But it's confusing to me as a budget document, because I'm being told that some of those positions are Howard Center contractors, so they're not really our FTE people. And then there's that other piece of the program, operational program that exists in Williston, but that's not reflected here. So I think that's part of the confusion for me. So I see what you're trying to do to get a streamline, to get everybody on the same page as far as titles and programs and that kind of thing, but it's still inequity.
That's our goal. But, I think Colleen's the one who put out there that, we hear from our principals or from people in the community that we have challenges around student behavior.
Yes.
And we hear it, and we hear it from our principals. And so Megan and I, about 2 months ago or a month ago, said, let's do this special round robin when we're going around, and we're really talking about these top areas here. We're not talking about this whole slide, we're talking about this right here. And how is this working in your school right now? Who are the people? And oh, by the way, who are the kids that need to benefit from that? And what have you done? And Megan's done a really good job of outlining, like, here are all the things you need to do before we get to this place here. And where are the kids on that continuum? And we've only done one school. I think we have one this week, right? And honestly, I say after any one of these meetings, I am so much smarter at the end of the meeting. And trust me, at the end of the 5 meetings, we are really smart, because we've had time to digest it all and think about it, and kind of like, from the one, I can guarantee you, Shelburne's the meeting, the school that we've met with, when we get to the next one, we'll be saying, oh, well, in Shelburne, right? We're starting to do that cross-pollination, so that at the end, when we bring it back to the whole lead team, we go, this is what we found. Now, what do we need to do, and how do we need to set a path that will address what we know are concerns? This slide is meant to show, like, are we meeting EQS? And to also let you guys know, is there equity, right? So it's both those things. And point taken around, we really do need to add the pieces that are funded other places as an equity piece, with maybe highlighted, so we'd say, like, that funding stream, we're not asking you to think about that. That is coming from some other place, but it is part of the equity picture, it's part of meeting EQS, and more importantly, it's part of meeting what you brought up. Like, we know there are challenges. It's not just us, it's everywhere, right? And so we are, digging deep, trying to figure out, like, what is the best way to make sure that I've come to say, like, every kid who comes to our school walks through the door in the morning and feels welcome, loved, cherished, and ready for the learning. What do we need to do that? So this is what that work is, and it's hard to show that on a single slide.
Oh, no, absolutely, and I want to voice support in that,
Yeah.
and as to go through this process is really important for the goals that we've
Right.
stated, so I'm fully supportive of that. And I just would encourage you, as you go through that process, what I'd be interested too as a board member is, I know some of our programs are grant funded in this work, and some of them are contract folks. And I'd really be interested, especially when we're talking about the rising cost of special ed, where are those, like, what is our true cost, so to speak? So I don't need an answer right now, but as you start thinking about those pieces, it will help us better explain, oh, here's why it looks like this, or these kinds of contracts are going up because this is why this looks like this.
And you had asked that question during the special ed budget, so that is something that we can, not in the 2 weeks between the special ed budget and this, but just know that that is in fact, the state, I think I shared this last time, about 3 or 4 years ago, the state actually asked us to separate out our budgets to be able to give that. So that is a number we can pull, just, that's part of the, definitely good information that we can get for you, just not on this yet.
What does a behavior coach do?
A behavior coach does a couple of things. One, they work directly with teams to be able to work with an individual kid to say, they're going to analyze a student's behavior, see what the functions are, and they're going to help develop a behavior plan and help the team around that kid be able to manage behavior. So that's kind of the team level support. And then they have a role kind of similar to our instructional coaches for reading and math, to just work with teachers around, how do I make sure all the kids in my class are engaged? Because if they're engaged, generally their behavior will be lower. How do I form relationships? How do I understand that many kids come into the system with a trauma background, and how do I accommodate that? So they both work with teachers to improve the teacher practice, and they work with individual teams to really dig in and plan for them.
Aren't the teachers supposed to learn some of this in college?
Well, I think most people would say that new teachers come in with some level of knowledge and do most of their learning on the job. It's kind of why we have coaches in all areas. Oh, sorry, Colleen, I think you were next.
No, I've spoken.
Okay, sorry.
Just more out of curiosity, what was the thought process of not including CVU on this slide?
So CVU's program we've sat down with Adam and looked at the same components, and they are on our bigger chart, but their behavior coach functions a little bit differently. That's a new position that CVU has this year that they haven't had in the past. They don't have a planning room in the same way that a K-8 school would, because developmentally that's not really how it looks at the high school. So it's a little bit, what we could do, and this is another good note to take, is put CVU with its, how do they touch on each of these components in a way that's appropriate to the high school.
And when we do our little round robin meeting, we are meeting
Right.
with the
Exactly.
admin team at CVU.
Yep. Oh, sorry. I don't know who I'm pointing at, actually.
So just thinking about the top three, because that's the main focus. So does the STRIDE program,
Yes.
the STRIDE program is the equivalent of like when you're looking at the steps, so there's 3 professionals for Charlotte, there's 3.5 for Heinsberg, there's 5 for Shelburne. It makes sense, like their
Right.
populations go up, but then we go to 4 for Williston. So is it the STRIDE program?
That's where you'd add that.
Well, yeah, I have a couple of things. One, the only professional in that top 3
Or
is the top.
I mean, maybe not, I mean full-time, I'm sorry, I didn't use the
FTE.
incorrect word, thank you.
So STRIDE is by design a therapeutic classroom. What they're doing right now is exploring ways to expand its reach. So Therapeutic Classroom is, they're a teaching team. And so kids who are accessing that program, by and large, receive most of their education in that program. It is really well designed so that they are connected to their typical team so that they can transition back in, but it's a placement for kids. What they're recognizing is that they can use the expertise that is in Stride more broadly like this, so they're in the process right now of exploring that. That's the other reason why they're not on this chart right now, is because they're just having really good conversations about expanding their reach. But at the moment, they are teaching a group of kids all day long.
Right, but I think that to kind of
But
get
it's
to
a
the
very,
thing
it's a
there.
very small group, so maybe I'm just not
Correct.
understanding, like maybe the safe harbor specialists are each only having contact with like 8 kids.
Oh.
So, and again, and I'm happy to talk about this. I want to make sure that you get to your, because we could present in more detail what Safe Harbor is intended to be, because Safe Harbor is intended to be a much more flexible program that doesn't teach kids all day long, and so therefore can serve more kids.
And I think the only reason I'm wondering about it is, I'm just wondering if like next budget season or the budget season after, will we be needing to ask for maybe 2 more FTEs or like?
I think that what Williston is doing right now is looking at how they use their current resources, both these ones and the ones that are in Stride, to see how they now can fill all those boxes. And I think they're still in that planning stage. But definitely, I mean, I would love to come
But
and
I
share
would
with
say
you.
that the students who are in Stride in Williston, in the other schools, are served by people who are Safe Harbor specialists.
Sometimes. The kids in Stride right now are placed there in their IEPs. And it's a more restrictive placement than.
Is it only kids on IEPs?
I think at the moment it is. It has historically, kids on IEPs or 504 plans.
And the goal is to get them back in the classroom?
Yep.
Megan, regarding SAPs, are our SAPs now all trained substance abuse professionals, as opposed to we've had in the past to sort of beg and borrow other disciplines to do that work? And I'm just wondering where we are now in terms of the professional attributes of our SAPs.
Yes, we have, and part of the rationale for increasing the FTE is to give more people full-time jobs. So yes, all of our SLPs are, so I'm going to say credentials. SAPs. Did I say SLPs?
Yeah.
I work with SLPs more often than SAPs. All of our SAPs do have the credential. Folks should know there actually is no more SAP credential formally anymore, which is unfortunate, I think. But all of ours met it before. They've all been in the district for a while. So I might have just confused that. The answer is yes.
Not at all. I mean, and I'm sure we would hope that even with that credential going away, that we would only employ those individuals with that kind of training and background and experience.
Yep, and we provide clinical supervision for them as a group. So it's part of our, it's connected to why we want to staff it this way, so that instead of having someone, it's hard to fill a .4 position. And historically, that's what we used to do, is fill a little, and now we have full-time staff, some of whom share buildings, but it's easier to recruit qualified people.
Yep. Thank you.
One more comment, question. I just want to reiterate Kelly's point earlier about having the funding streams connected to some of these positions. I know for years, like last year or the year before, we might say we have a $72 million budget or $76 million budget, but we have not been including a lot of the pass-through money. We are a fiscal agent for a lot of federal funding that comes through, or there might be some state funding, and I've often felt that we're missing our opportunity in the community to talk about all the money that goes through our schools, whether we're raising it from taxes, but you know, that pass-through money, I think, is an important part of our obligation as a board. We are overseeing how that money gets spent. So I just wanted to reiterate what I think I heard Kelly saying was looking for more information about the pass-through funding that goes through our budget to support some of these positions.
Yep, and we did
To better
just talk
understand
about that internally, that,
So what we'll do is in the first meeting we have in January, when we talk revenue, I'll also take you through the grants.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Yep, but it is kind of important to focus, I know it's hard to focus, focus on the resources and the kids here, and then we can get to the funding, otherwise it could get very kludgy, and I think it's and you know me, I love money. I'm happy to do money, but it's really important to know this is the resources that Megan and her experts think we need in the system to help our kids.
Right.
And then to get distracted on, is this a grant or is this something else? It's just, so we're gonna do the grants separate. If it doesn't work for you, then next year we'll change the way we present it.
Yeah,
But
it's
that's
just
our
helpful
thoughts.
when we're talking with community that because we do always talk about how Health and Human Services, we need support from the agency, and we actually do get support from the agency, and it would help us with talking points in the community to better understand how that funding works for us.
yep, you got a little bit of that in the special ed presentation when I overviewed the special ed grants, IDB. We talked a little bit about Medicaid, and then you'll see probably that again, actually.
Yeah, we'll put them all together.
All together so that you see it all at once.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Back to that previous slide. How are all these people held accountable? I mean, the SAP person, does they actually have an effect on drug and alcohol use?
There's
I
lots
mean,
of.
do we have data to support it? The behavior coach, do we have data to support that this person is actually changing behavior and so on?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
We have outcome data behind all of these. They're all supervised, either receiving both their clinical supervision, their administrative supervision, and we look at data a lot. We look at outcomes a lot to make
Outcomes,
sure
yes.
that they are effective, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Adam, did you get the number we were looking for?
Yeah.
I don't know, I didn't know if you did.
The positions of 120.
Yeah.
Yes, so it was 2 math, 2 science, 1 social studies.
Okay.
And
So those are
and
teachers.
it all corresponds to that larger junior class that we have.
So we guessed that. Chapter 3, focus areas. So these are the initiatives that we've been focused on in building this budget and that we've been working on, some of them for a long time. First one, early literacy. I'm going to let Jeff speak a little bit to that and some of the work that we're doing. Equity literacy, a charge that the board gave and some work that I'm doing around that. And then an opportunity that presented itself while we were looking at the equity matrix around essential arts and seeing that there were some inequities and we could right-size it while offering more opportunities that we think are necessary opportunities. So, Jeff, so these are the ads in the budget. So I'm gonna let Jeff talk to the first one.
So, as Colleen mentioned about the grants, and we're going to show you those revenue streams. I manage about $1 million worth of federal grants 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Title I speaks specifically to helping support struggling learners. And at this time last year, we had 3 schools that qualified for Title I services. And this is all completely based on your free and reduced lunch population numbers, FRL. And so at this time last year, we had 3 schools receiving services. I had 1.9 FTE at ABS. We had 1.6 FTE at SCS and 1.5 at HCS. And they were all dedicated to early literacy support. And they're Title I teachers. Most of them are reading recovery trained or LLI, leveled literacy intervention trained, to work in one-on-one or small groups with our neediest learners on literacy skills. Been very effective program. Their data is really remarkable in many ways. And then we discovered that going into this current year, that Williston no longer qualified for those services, yet they had 1.9 FTE dedicated to this really essential service. And so I took a creative look at some of the other grants I managed to try to make it possible to move some FTE into the general ed budget as an offset. So we still have 1.5 people at ABS dedicated to providing supports, but they are no longer Title I funded. And then, unfortunately, we got the numbers back for next year and found out that Shelburne will no longer qualify next year either. And we currently, because we shifted the ABS resources over to Heinsberg and Shelburne, Shelburne currently has 1.9 FTE, and we want to be able to do a similar, take a similar approach to that. But I'm out of flexibility with my other grants, and so Megan has been very helpful, and we are looking at ways to support that through general ed and try to keep 1.5 FTE there as well. But it means that those resources next year will be shifted entirely to Heinsberg. And that is a result of Heinsberg's free and reduced lunch numbers increasing, where the other schools had minimal reductions in their numbers. But the way it works is if you're not a school-wide program, and we are not, you have to have a certain threshold for the district of kids who qualify to be school-wide. If you're not, then you are targeted assistance. And the way targeted assistance works is they take the average FRL number for the district, and ours is about 14% heading into next year. And anybody over that gets services, anybody under it does not within your district. And so for a long time, we had 3 schools receiving services, and for the first time since I've been here, we will only have 1 next year because of the dynamic of the numbers increasing at Heinsberg mostly.
And those students that needed services, they didn't go away.
And those students didn't go
They
away,
still need
exactly.
services.
And for how big our schools are, could that just be like 5 more kids, or like, or are
Smaller
we?
the school is, it has,
Yeah,
yes, a
right.
much greater
For
impact when you
Heinsberg.
have 1 or 2 students in Heinsberg, for instance.
And then just to go back to some questions you were asking before, you, Jeff, in particular, that's what affects what it looks like on that slide. That's why it could be that like Charlotte and Williston and Shelburne look like they're getting fewer resources. They're not. It's just we've had to like account for this kind of windfall that Heinsberg got in resources.
And they look at it individually by school as opposed to district-wide,
They do, yeah.
and there's no talk of looking at
Well,
it.
in fact, they take the average in the district, and you've got, whatever that average is, you have to be above the average to get the money.
Oh,
So that's, I mean, it's a crazy way of
But you're,
doing
but
it.
you're right, and
This is crazy, but that.
you're right, in a state that requires consolidation,
Yeah.
those services are determined only school by school.
And so the 1.5
district
add is to make sure that Shelburne continues to have
Similar services.
early,
Early literacy,
early
intervention
literacy.
services from highly trained professionals. Yes.
How much were the decreases in Williston and Shelburne?
So last year, heading into this year, they had 1.9 FTE, they currently have 1.5, so 0.4. Same thing is proposed for Shelburne next year, so it would be a decrease of 0.4.
in free and
Oh, and free and reduced, I'm sorry.
No, but the point is that they didn't have to reduce, Heinsberg went up.
Yeah, but there was a slight reduction. It was very slight. I would say right now, in fact, for years, Williston was the second neediest in those regards, and then Shelburne. And now CVU is second, just under 14%. Then it's Williston, and now it's Shelburne. So there's been some significant shifts.
But the reduction in free and reduced is really insignificant. It's because of how they run the formula.
that is crazy.
Yeah.
Can I
agree.
Can I totally hijack this moment? Just to speak as an indicators committee member, this was the information we were learning and then proposing the new board budget goals. It's things like this that we were hearing and thinking like, well, we can't just, that's amazing that you did that shuffling, but we need to make it a priority, make sure it's a priority when we know that we have these problems. So it just felt like a good moment to like, see? This is why we, pegged early literacy as a budget priority, and as an expository moment to say, like, it's that kind of information that we'll use. Again, process will be totally different, but to make those decisions in the future, the budget priority decisions.
The last piece I'll share about that sticks in my craw the most is that these services are completely determined by the census numbers in October when they're actually at their lowest, and they don't reflect the actual numbers. The reason they're at their lowest is every year you have to reapply for these services, and they let you carry forward through September, and then everybody has to reapply. And there is a natural lag with a lot of these families not applying in time, and so October is always our lowest numbers. Our lowest numbers are always in October, rather. And months from now, the numbers will look quite different and be quite a bit higher, but it won't impact this funding. And then the other challenge is we're just completely anticipating, because I don't get my allocations until June, so 7 months before I get my allocations, we have to guess how it's going to impact the budget.
Do we do any outreach during that time to parents?
We've done a lot more outreach
Yeah,
this year than ever
yeah.
before. We're learning lessons and trying, and
Because remember, this also affects food service, because
Sure,
if they
yes.
fall off
Yeah.
of free and reduced,
Yes.
now those families still can't pay.
I mean, maybe not social work, but like guidance counselors or something could like personally reach out to
We
people.
do
and just
that,
ask
we
them.
do that, we do that, we do that.
And I don't mean just like families we think.
No, all
I just mean
families.
all families. Like, I don't mean
All
like
families, yep.
targeting certain people,
Yep.
but just, because there are some people who might qualify who don't even think that they do qualify.
Could we write a letter about it? Just like an op-ed about what the programs are, like the grant funding, how it works, why we benefit, what it means with consolidation between the schools now, because we're not just looking at Shelburne as a school district, we're looking at Shelburne in terms of Heinsberg, and, because it's new learning.
yeah, I think it's a fair point. We're open to any suggestions. We all got our heads together in the beginning of the school year to try to address this possibility. And I think we did make some significant changes. But yeah, this is where we are.
Is there any discussion happening around the state about this in reference to consolidation and other districts?
A little bit, to be quite honest, and I meet monthly with a lot of my colleagues. A lot of my colleagues are in school-wide program districts. Targeted assistance is a relatively rare phenomenon in our state, more so in our region, but we don't have as many colleagues in that same boat. So that's the reasoning behind that.
But yeah, and I wonder about outreach to our federal
Yep.
delegation.
Yep.
So we happen to have some extraordinarily senior people that can
Yeah.
stick things on.
So the next item on there, essential arts, I'll speak to that one first, and STEM, although they're all in the same package. The first one, point 8 of this, is to address the added challenge that exists, somebody brought it up, of having 2 schools within the same system. So at Allenbrook and Williston Central, they have, 0.8 of an art teacher who does 0.5 here and 0.3 there. They have 1.0 of a phys ed teacher who does 0.6 here and 0.4 there, and on it goes. And the truth is that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well for the teacher, and it doesn't really work very well for us and for you, because we have to give them like an hour in the middle of the day to travel back and forth and have their lunch, and it's not an efficient way of doing business. So they asked if we could fix that. That's what that 0.8 is. It also addresses that Williston really was very, very low in terms of, or high ratios in art. They have 1.8 art teacher for like their 700 something kids, and there are that many in Shelburne for a couple hundred less. So
I guess the other thing is that really struck me was like the administration there is trying to do some really forward-thinking work around their schedule, and they're limited by their art and music teacher. That's just not the thing we need to do. So in my old world, I would never have proved this, but it was the impassioned plea by administration who did all this work.
I've taken Jean's role now.
That did all this work on a really creative, forward-thinking schedule, and then saw it blow up because they couldn't fit their art teachers moving back and forth.
I'm positive you guys thought about this, but I still feel I need to ask, do we have space to add more, like gym, to add more art and stuff? Is there?
It actually goes unused, right?
Yeah.
The art room does at Allen.
Right.
No.
Yeah, no, there's not a space issue.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna say this again. I'm really lacking context, and I think maybe the budget committee has dived a little deeper into this, I don't know. But I don't know is this a change from what to what, or when we
These are
say
all ads.
enhancements, these are all ads?
Every single one of these, and we're gonna speak to each one. So Jeff spoke to the first one, which is a direct result of losing Title I funds and having no flexibility around that.
And so for me, it would be really helpful to have like a column next to it that has notes that's like change from something to something, or reflects this district wanting to preserve a program after loss of funding. I just want to be able to explain it to community members, and I feel a lack of information, and I know I'm sounding like a squeaky wheel on this one, and I want to be a squeaky wheel on this one. I need the context.
I think when we used to do, these would, in the past, be considered decision packets in a way, except they've already been decided, which is fine. But when we used to get the decision packets, Shelburne had a really good model. I think it was Shelburne, maybe it was Williston, wasn't sure.
Heinsberg had a great model. We had a
There was a
matrix
sheet.
that explained why.
Well, no, I was
Yeah.
thinking of the sheet.
But everybody did it.
The sheet, it was almost like the application for the decision packet. It said what the packet was, why it was needed, if it currently existed, what would happen if it didn't get funded, and kind of the rationale behind it. And I think it was just helpful to really understand, so that we're not peppering you all with a million questions.
We can do that for these.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for us to do decision packets. I
No.
need
It's the
to
background.
understand
Just
the
the
background.
The background
We'll
piece.
give you that background information, just that. Here's what it is, here's why we're asking for it, here's what will happen if you don't.
Fund it, right, well,
We can do
right.
that.
And where it meets our goals.
Well, yeah, that's
Because
gotta be why
really,
we're doing
right?
it. That's
Yeah,
why we're gonna do
exactly.
it.
Yeah, I do want to remind everyone that every one of these asks here are asked to support the goals that we as a board set for
Yeah,
administration.
We don't question that whatsoever. I'm not questioning that at all. I'd want to understand, so early literacy supports, we had 3.0 FTE, we're changing to 4.5 FTE. I don't know, I'm making this up, I don't know. And these are the reasons we're doing it, because we had grant funding, we lost the grant funding. It's important to us to meet our mission and vision, and this is why we're putting this into the budget.
We will do that for you. That won't be hard to do because we certainly have had all those conversations.
And I think all this information has been out there. I just think it's been over a big, large chunk of time. So like last year, I remember with you guys standing up there talking, we were asking about it, maybe it wasn't even last year, maybe it was the year before, I don't know, but the essential arts, like we wanted to know what is the equity of essential arts. And so I know for one, the first thing I picked up on was that second line. I was like, oh, good, we're addressing that, but it's hard to remember what those ratios were.
But I think if we do what they're asking
Yeah.
for, then you'll have that.
Yeah.
And then you can decide, but we really do come to it, like looking at your board goals, which I'm gonna say again, and what we really believe is the best budget to provide the kind of instructional program that we think you want for your kids, right? And sometimes that means an ad, sometimes it means shifting something. So I'm just gonna keep going through this, but we will, for the next meeting, or even before the next meeting, we can provide that kind of paperwork that you're asking for.
Thank you.
So the point 8 of that second line is addressing Williston, the two buildings, and the transportation problem that causes them to not even be able to do anything with their schedule. The 1.0 is 2.5 STEM teachers, one in Heinsberg, one in Charlotte. that brings into equity the essential arts piece. So if you go back to that slide, essential arts, with that factored in, we have good equity across the board. Williston already has that. Shelburne, we are working with administration on how to do that. Lots of moving pieces. In education, when you have a lot of moving pieces, it involves a lot of real-life human beings, and so I can't really share with you all the conversations that we're having, but there are conversations about how to make sure that that same educational opportunity exists in Shelburne. I just can't right now tell you, and it's not gonna have a budget impact. I could also tell you that in Shelburne, they're already getting some of that programming through existing people. CVU leadership and CVU guidance, we have the expert here, our illustrious high school principal, and I'm gonna let you talk about that. And remember at the beginning when I said that this is year-round budgeting for us too, that it starts like that? And remember I said that like this budget cycle will not even have ended before principals will start talking about, I have this idea. Well, I think about 2 years ago, Adam said to me, I'd like to talk to you about a grand idea I have. And some of that is coming into play now. So I just want to set that up. This isn't an idea that Adam had in October of this year. He's been thinking about this for 2 years now. So take it away.
Yeah, I'd say longer than 2 years, I'd say.
Oh, that's when you shared it with me.
Which goes back to my first budgeting cycle with this group, and I think we were faced with reducing about $800,000 at CVU. So, and that was some reality that Jeff lived with as well back in 2013, 14, something like that. So I'm going to talk about these two positions kind of globally, because I actually think they serve the same outcome, and actually it maybe a nice entrance into talking about them was the discussion around the behavior coaches and some of the confusion of like, what does that actually mean and what does it do? So when I think about behavior coaches, I actually think about I think about students who are communicating through externalized behaviors. So you'll remember the ACEs studies and the ACEs work that you did, I think, last year. So looking at adverse childhood experiences and what happens when young people are faced with those experiences, and how often we get trapped into, all humans get trapped when we're really stressed in our limbic systems, and we're not exactly able to express our needs verbally. We tend to express our needs via behavior, and behavior coaches, I think, help us interpret some of that behavior and help us figure out how to work with young people, particularly when they're dysregulated. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked with a dysregulated human being before. I would imagine that you have, since you are a human being and you're sitting here, that you've experienced this at some point in your life. A 1.0 FTE position can absolutely be a 1.0 to a 1-to-1 ratio with a student who's dysregulated. Now, that's not, of course, the intent. When we have our coaches, it's how do we work with our teachers and our systems so that our systems are supporting all of our young people. So I use that as an approach. I was just looking at our most recent Engage data, so the surveys that we gave out to all of our students, and we had about over 1,100 respondents. And I was pleased to see that 950 or so said that they had a trusted adult, and that that 950 also said they felt highly respected in the building, which I think is great. Conversely, we also had 267 students who were neutral to strongly disagree that life feels manageable outside of school. So that's a pretty big number. What scares me about that number is actually when I think we do a really good job in this district when people are dysregulated and they are externalizing their behavior, right? We know that's a really strong cue that we need to work with this person. I am fearful about, when I think of particularly about a school like CVU of 1,330 students, who don't we know about, right? Who are the students that might silently be struggling, who need some support and need some connection? By the way, of the 267 plus students who said they felt that life was unmanageable outside of school, 2 times more likely to be those who identify themselves as female answered that life felt strongly. So that corresponds to some data that I think we're seeing across the U.S. So when I think about the needs that we're seeing and the great things that we're seeing, I'm certainly not pessimistic. But when we look particularly at the way our guidance system is set up, our school counselors are primarily at a 1 to 305 ratio right now. So we have basically 4 FTE positions, 1 per each house, and then we have a flexible pathways counselor who works primarily with our students in our technical programs and those who are seeking education in creative and really cool ways. But a 1 to 300 ratio to me is not a great ratio in terms of the support that students really need. So we're pretty good at reactive, right? If we have 1, 5, 7 students who are dysregulated in a particular day and seeking out their school counselor, we're not really able to provide the proactive counseling that we want. We're not able to work with our transitions from 9th to 10th grade, the type of counseling that we think of the curriculum that we want to offer with our school counselors. So the intent is to change some of those ratios by adding another school counselor in to support our students and to support our adults as well. So I think this also connects to the addition of a house director or an administrator. So if you go back, again, I think to, was it 2013 or so?
I believe the 2015 budget.
2015 budget. The projections at the time was that CVU was going to be around 1,100 students at this particular, by the year 2019, 2020.
How long ago was that number?
It's about 4 years ago.
4 or 5 years ago. So we're at 1,300 plus. We're at 1,330 last year. We had 66 transfer students in over the summer. So our numbers are not declining as I think it was NASDAQ projections suggested. And I think at the time when we reduced a house director, it was the absolute smart move for the moment. We were able to use one of our other house directors as a lead in around curriculum design and curriculum development and instruction and assessment. But what that meant was that we had 2 people dealing with about 650 kids when there were more behavior management issues that come up, or department leadership, or supervision evaluation. You can imagine how many times when you're working with a teacher to do supervision evaluation, and if you're in charge of working with 650 students around behavior management, you can imagine what your schedule looks like during the day. There's always something happening with 650 students. When I go back a few years to when I was a house director, so I was house director for the Snelling house, which is a long time ago now. One of the things that I enjoyed most was that I was able to lead the English department and the science department. I was able to teach a class. I was able to be the house director for 300 students. I was able to be closely connected with my core team. And I think most importantly, I was able to build proactive relationships with those 300 students because I took ownership of them. All of our kids belong to the entire school, but I also had a special focus on those 300 students. That is a different experience. When you double that number, your experience as a house director changes. So fast forward a little bit, you think about my first year here, one of the big reductions that we were faced with making was reducing our leadership team from the guidance director position. So if you go back to Jeff's time, our leadership team shrank from 8 to 6. And basically, I took on leading the Direction Center, which the school counselors will tell you, I don't do a great job. I do the best I can, but it's not the wisest pairing in the world. So the goal with this leadership position is to move back to a 4 house director model, but having one of those house directors be in the lead of the Direction Center also. So that there is that future visioning, the ability to move that group in the ways that group needs to be moved. The group is asking for that position now, while also keeping one of our house directors being a primary focus. And I think this is a really important move that Jeff made around that curriculum instruction and assessment, so that we've got someone who's really taking ownership over that as well. So we made really important strides as a school, but I think this is a smart move right now. I will tell you that we have our decision packets. We do decision packet, 15 decision packets school-wide. Unanimously, our program council, our leadership team, other teachers who have weighed in, put these to the top. These are our basically even at the top for importance, for follow-through, for all kinds of things.
Can you just say, you said right now each of the guidance counselors are associated with the house?
Yes.
And there are 4.
Correct.
So the 5th one would be?
So right now we have, the 5th one right now is working with flexible pathways. So the addition of another resource, we absolutely need to figure out specifically how that's going to look. So we know we don't want to lose that connection, that 9 through 12 connection. That's really important. But also those numbers aren't tenable. So are we trading and taking turns at someone doing a little bit of response counseling? That's one idea that's out there. So that, that when we're planning for classes, our students can actually, meet and plan what their schedule looks like, and we can have some deal with whatever that crisis happens to be in that moment for that young person who's coming in. But we need to work on that model.
And do the kids, and maybe Elise, you would be able to better answer this, because I can't remember when my kids were here. Are you more connected to your, like if you were in crisis, maybe this isn't fair to ask, but would you be more likely to go to your advisor who you see every day, or to a guidance counselor? I'm just curious, you're talking about engaging with those 200 kids who haven't, so.
And I think that's a great question. I think it really depends on your relationship with your advisor, which in student council, we were talking about this, how it can vary a lot, your relationship with your advisor and how that works. For me personally, I feel like I would be, I would like to go to my counselor, because I feel like that's kind of on my career path journey, but you can definitely talk to either one. It's really a student by student connection. But I have heard recently, I was just talking about this the other day with some other students, about how they would like some more guidance support in that area, because I think a lot of the times we always associate the guidance counselors with, what am I going to schedule next? I need to schedule something. But they should also be there for like emotional support, or like a traditional counselor role, which I think if we were to establish something like that, I think that could be beneficial to a lot of kids.
I have 2 questions. So basically going off of what you just said, I was wondering, what does guidance look like? Just my own experience in high school, and I mean, it seemed like whenever anyone went to the guidance office, it wasn't because we were looking for social emotional support. It was that we were going for scheduling, or because we were about to be looking at colleges or the next step after. So I was just wondering if that is what guidance was doing currently.
That too.
And then the second question was, so are there 2 house directors currently, or 3 house directors?
There are currently 2 house directors, and then we have another administrator who's in charge of curriculum. So if there was another, so if a CVU leadership team person came on, would there then be 4 house directors? Yes. So we'd have to shift the job responsibilities a little bit, so that each person is able to be in charge of a house and do the professional development leadership that we need them to do.
So would that be what, kind of, is that when you envision your 4 chief house directors whose a part of their responsibility is house director, and then part of their responsibility to you would be part of this executive leadership team that would maybe be 4 different tasks now, not just curriculum and not just flexible pathways, but something that can move CVU as a whole forward? I mean, you'd have more resources, I think, to do that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The goal, you know, one of the important pieces that an administrator and a house director plays is they are the people who see the synthesis points in the organization. So, for instance, I think house director, there are some schools that will have teachers run departments. I don't think that's a great idea typically, because those same teachers also aren't dealing with the places in the building where we see teacher behaviors or teacher functioning disrupting students, actually. So you need, or when you see schools get very compartmentalized around their departments, you need people who can kind of see the joints in the organization, for lack of a better term. I know that's not a very good description. So that it's really important to have the folks who are doing the professional development leadership also be the people who really are understanding how that's playing out within the building. And I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Yeah.
We used to talk about house directors as comparative to principals of a smaller school, so that the individual houses would be like schools within a larger school. Would you say that that still applies?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. That's what I was trying to say.
It's clear.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I also think about the future leadership of CVU. I think, you know, one of the most important kind of ethics in this district has been around strong leadership. And when I look at our next generation of leaders, I don't see a whole lot of teachers looking at our current house director model and saying, wow, that looks like a lot of fun to be dealing with reactively with behaviors all day long. That's what I really want to do. And so as we're thinking about growing leadership in the next 5, 10, 15 years, I think it's important that we have those positions that actually call to teachers and say, yeah, I want to, not only do I want to be able to support our families and our community, but I want to help my colleagues grow, and I want to, and that's, I think, where the mini principal thing comes into play.
And historically, I'd like to just interject that Adam and I were both house directors at the same time, both also teachers. So were many of our other house director colleagues were teachers. And that since has changed since we changed this model in terms of the desire among faculty members to look into this.
And as a board, we have continued to support the concept of growing leadership, providing strong supports for people to take on more leadership roles and learn about leadership. It's not intuitive.
What exactly do guidance counselors do? I don't know who I should address that to, but in all my years in education, I've never actually figured that out.
The better question is, what don't they do? They do a tremendous amount. So
You can't use the word guidance or counseling.
You know, I think from, you know, I mean, I could look at this week from dealing with a student who has experienced a sexual assault and getting that person hooked up to the appropriate resources, to dealing with students who are economically disadvantaged and don't have food, to, hey, how do I take the PSAT? What is that like? I'm really nervous about it. To, I'm really unhappy in my class right now. to, what future career planning might you want to do. I mean, there's the role of the school counselor is a broad one. I think about support and I think about transitions being two things that really guide that role. And also working with teachers about that social emotional support that individual students need. They are communicating constantly.
And don't forget college applications in the process of guiding.
Yeah, and I want to say something about that.
And I just want to add one other thing too, from my experience as a house director, working with the person who was the counselor in the same house, how consistently she was interacting with families of students who have high anxiety, who aren't coming to school because of the anxiety, who are trying to find therapeutic placements. It is a constant stream that extends beyond the school day and into the weekends often.
I also see the CVU, the house director, and the guidance being somewhat overlapping, somewhat redundant.
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, I see it that in that yes, in terms of, I think the ultimate goal is to create an environment that's as supportive for students as possible. The level to which that's happening, I think of the school counselor tends to be more of a one-on-one initiative, a one-on-one focus. House director can be that as well, but they're also looking at the way that the systems interact with one another and shaping those systems, whether it's working with teachers, also working with families. So I think they are overlapping that goal, but the systems levels are different grain size in the organization.
You said something interesting to me earlier in the presentation where you said if you have a house director who's also a teacher, the house director who's also teaching might not understand what's going on over here, where a teacher's having like a disruptive behavior for the kids or something. Can you elaborate on the relationship between the house director and the teacher and what that looks like?
Yeah, so the house director would be in charge of, typically one or two departments. So when I was a house director, I oversaw English. I looked at the ways in which we want to grow our teaching practices within the building and specifically within that department. I was also teaching at that particular time, so it was fun to be able to try to implement those strategies as best I could. But at the end of the day, as great of relationships I have with my colleagues, it's also my responsibility if someone is not, there's an accountability piece, there's a supervision piece, there's an evaluation piece, so that you can help people grow and also help people solve issues. So, we've got 3 kids in this class, there was some type of academic dishonesty. Okay, how do we deal with that? So it becomes a problem-solving piece as well, along with budgeting, those types of things.
We're also responsible for evaluating all the folks within our departments. And so sometimes it's 2 or 3 departments each house director is associated with. And so there's also a pretty heavy lift with making sure that you're doing all those evaluations and being in a classroom and evaluating a teacher, and now somebody needs you urgently because one of your kids in your house is dysregulated.
And it's much more, I don't mean to go too heavy on the accountability piece, because actually it's much more about growth and support. We have teachers all the time who are saying, this situation or this class is feeling like unmanageable right now, or I'm frustrated, I feel like this unit, this lesson's not working. That's also where they may turn to a house director and say, can you come in and help me out with this? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing right?
I think the call to administration for the last 10, 15 years is to be instructional leaders. And it's hard to be an instructional leader when all you're doing is putting out fires. Mm-hmm. And when that's missing, that really does say to the next generation of potential leaders, I don't want to do that job. I want to be the instructional leader. And I think that it also says to teachers, we don't care that much about that, right? So I think that's the heart of it is, and the EQS, I was just looking at this, the EQS around leadership says this, the numbers thing is 1, if you have 10, you need 1. And beyond that, it's a lot of language around, you need to have enough so that people can be instructional leaders. And what I'm hearing Adam say is, we don't have enough so that people can be instructional leaders. They're running around managing behavior. And maybe that's part of the crunch, maybe that's what you're thinking. That's part of the crunch that's happening with guidance, because also instead of like inspiring kids and supporting kids and helping kids with their college or whatever, they're also putting out fires. So when you don't have enough of something, everybody's kind of running around putting out fires instead of really focusing on the work they need to do to make sure that the system is as great as it can be.
I have very high standards for instructional leaders, but we'll get to that
Yeah.
later. I'm looking at the educational quality standards here for counseling. And for elementary schools, it's 1 to 300.
Yep.
We have 1 to 180 at Charlotte, 1 to 168 at Heinsberg, 1 to 170 at Shelburne, 1 to 160 at
Wait, how about
Williston.
that? No, wait, that can't be right, because
Well,
in
that's what it
Charlotte,
says.
Remember that the EQS number, Ray, includes, because this is just how EQS measures it, includes the counselor, but it also includes social work, SAP.
right, but even if you were including just the counselor, there are 370 kids in Charlotte, so it can't be 1 to whatever that number is that you just
But I
said.
think Megan's saying if you include just social work and the SAP, that's why the number's gonna look smaller.
And we do have a lot of SEL people between the behavior coach, the planning room director, safe harbor specialist, school psychologist, school social worker, and school counselor. There's what seems to have quite a few people involved in there.
Yeah, that's the ratio that you've got there for, we meet that, we meet those ratios.
I just think
That
to
ratio
Adam's-
is lower at the high school.
I think to the point that you made early on, Adam, about the fact that one very dysregulated student can absorb one staff person's entire day. And I think if we didn't have to concern ourselves with maintaining a certain budget level, we would love to have more people in our schools. I mean, school counselors have unique training in diagnostic assessment and treatment interventions. They're highly trauma-informed. And when you look specifically at the master's level training for a school counselor today, they are perfectly matched to being in school settings. That's what they train for. And their training is very different, I'm presuming, and you can correct me, but than the training maybe of someone who moves into a leadership position, that those are different tracks. And while there's some overlapping for sure, that unique training with school counselors, I think, is highly important. One of the things that and you've, I think stated this so very well, but I want to be certain I'm understanding clearly. If you were able to garner one more school counselor for next year, and because schools essentially define how school counselors are going to function, really, in terms of the responsibilities that they are given, do you see this counselor, or at least now amongst all of your counselors, that extra FTE would really be able to be primarily devoted to counseling and to student support as opposed to scheduling or administrative services, et cetera? I mean, do you see this as really bumping up the capacity to do more actual counseling and mental health assessment within the high school?
I don't see that person doing that necessarily, but I see that person enabling the other counselors who are there to be able to do the job that they know they need to do.
So the amount of assessment, of intervention, of overall counseling work, as we think traditionally of counseling, would go up because of the addition of that position.
I'll tell you one poignant moment I had this year. I had a student, when I was talking about the Direction Center, and she said to me, yeah, I wanted to go meet my counselor, but I know how busy they are, so I just felt bad and I didn't want to bother her. I was like, ooh, man, and I loved it because it was that's such a cool, polite thing for a kid to want to do, but also not necessarily how we want our Direction Center to do it. So
I have spent enough time in public teaching to know about dysregulated students. I live by the planning room.
I presume this is similar here, but I think it's easy to think too that there's a need for more of that counseling, sort of mental health support, but that sort of administrative side, that college stuff, I mean, my experience has been just so many kids who fall through the cracks in the post-secondary process because it's a ton of work. And if you don't have family at home doing that with you, there are not enough counselors to fill in for the kids who are really doing it on their own, to really support that process. And so I think as much as there are the mental health needs, the needs around that are for very vulnerable students as well. And whether they launch after 12th grade somewhere or not that's the biggest measure on us as a district, and that's really the most important thing we do, so.
I know, when I write a letter of recommendation, and then I look at our counselors who are writing in the hundreds,
Yeah.
you know, and trust me, when that first deadline comes around for the college apps, you don't want your school counselors being the most stressed out place in the building, but it often is.
So that's exactly the point I wanted to make, Erin, because many of us were at the VSBA conference this fall, and we heard two students who were, just out, one of them just heading out to college, one of them just out of, it was Winooski and Middlebury. Both of them were first generation, right? And the young woman from Middlebury just kind of like, as an aside, said, and for me, the college, looking for colleges was very different from the friends that I made playing sports. And she talked about like how sports were important for her to, expand her friendship base. And she said, so they were all talking about like my mom saying I should apply to this school, that school. She said, I went home and I said to my mom, what school should I apply to? And my mom said, whatever one you want to, dear. And she said, I got no support for that. And I know, like, it's not that you're thinking about hiring a person to do that, but it opens up the capacity for people to address that. And honestly, I agree with you. Like, we need to support those kids. We really need to support those kids. And both those kids were so articulate about how, and they weren't even saying it, but those of us sitting in the audience, we could hear how hard it is and how different it is for them compared to, kids whose parents have gone to college. They've been through the whole system. They know how it works.
It sounds like these two, it sounds like you've identified some pain points, and in an ideal world would have like 5 FTEs up here or something, but that you've identified these two positions as being quite complementary in a way, or at least supporting each other's work in ways that can't necessarily be easily articulated or graphed and explained, but that these two positions will give you the flexibility you need to creatively solve the 5 problems with the 2 people. Is that accurate?
I think that's a good way of saying that.
Yeah, just kind of a comment. So it seems like the need is now, but do you feel like by next year you're gonna have other like measurable metrics or something that you could come to us and say, hey, this is what these positions did for me? So you use like the student feedback survey, which was great. I think that was huge. And there must have been other factors that you looked at, that you didn't share with us. But I think in the future, it will be nice to feel, the benefit from this addition.
Yes, I mean, some of the benefits hard to describe, but I also, I could bring in, okay, here are the number of evaluations that we were supposed to do this year. Here are the number of classroom walkthroughs we didn't get to. Because, and that data isn't necessarily easily grabbed, but I could get it.
I mean, from the student perspective, I think making the guidance counselor position just more clear of what we can go to talk to them about, I think would open up more people to what they have to offer, because they have so much training and so much to give, but I'm not sure if all the students are aware that, hey, there is someone there for you. And so if you added another position to make it easier for people to have the time and schedule the time with them, I think that could really be good. But the biggest way it's going to be used is if the students are aware of what they can use it for.
Who was that movie where if you build it, they will come? But it seems to me like, oh yeah, if you have another guidance counselor, people will come. If you don't have another counselor, well, they won't come.
Field of Dreams.
Field of dreams, yeah.
But I have to say, I hear Erin's point and support it. To launch the 12th graders in their direction, technical school or college, and I feel, I was in high school too, and I've spent a lot of time in Walls and have not a very positive experience with guidance, but what's happening today in school is radically different in the past 10 years than what was happening, right? Even when we started, like when I started on this board almost 10 years ago, it's different. The problems are different, the anxiety levels are different, school shootings are a real thing, and it's something that kids are talking about all the time in the middle school. So by the time my 6th grader gets to your school, that is going to be a hot topic of conversation. I want trained people to be there, to be supportive of our kids as they work through issues that may or may not, hopefully, ever affect them. I think the issues are real.
Yeah, and they're not, what was I was looking at a statistic recently that was talking about anxiety referrals or anxiety visits to the emergency department, right? It's like up 600% in the last few years. Things are not getting simpler for our young people right now. And I will tell you that when you are a school counselor for 100 to 300 students, the number of students who are experiencing some type of anxiety related issue that need support, that you need to give them your attention. And it's not just 10 minutes for one moment, let's get you regulated and get you back to class, right? And that would be nice. And we're working on systems to do that, to re-regulate quickly, but we need more personnel there. And not to get really heavy, but when you have a 100 to 300 caseload and you have 2 or 3 students die in a school year, like we did last year, you can imagine the ripple effects of what that's like to work in a building, and particularly in a guidance department that is already pretty tired. So it's a position we need.
We're in a very fortunate county in Vermont, but even our county lacks mental health resources. It needs to touch these people that need the help. And that's what we're dealing with. There's a lack of resources on the outside, and like it or not, we're the front lines on the inside.
Okay, one more question.
Well, I just also, I wanted to speak in support of the addition of the administrative position and the restructuring of your house structure, because as great as teachers are when they come out of the box, the best that any preparation program can do is a well-prepared novice, and the complexity of education requires ongoing learning, and having instructional leadership in our buildings is so incredibly important. And I'm just really pleased to see this proposal before us, and I really support both of the concepts. Thank you.
Okay. If for some reason in the middle of the night you wake up with a burning question about any of these, feel free to email Brendan. Wake him up in the middle of the night. You can CC me, but thank you, Adam. No, Brendan, and then CC me. Isn't that what we agreed on?
Yeah, that's what we agreed
Isn't that
on.
what I paid you? Yeah.
So in this proposed budget, remember that line, I'll flash that up here again, is also a response to the equity audit, and it's a placeholder, because we haven't finished the equity audit. Last time, when we were at student council, Lynn and I went to student council last month, we got their input about, like, what are we missing here? Here's how we're doing this, how might we do this? And we're learning along the way, so that if you approve the budget with this $95,000 in it, we would have up to $95,000. That's a placeholder for a person, if that's what we thought was the best thing. But it's not, I can't even like speak to it the way Adam just did about guidance or administration, right? We believe that there is a need there. We're not sure exactly what that need is. Safe harbor restructure, yes.
And I'm supposed to vote for something that you don't know what the need is?
Well, you're gonna tell it. You charged me with doing an audit, right? And so that's the audit that we're doing now. And the simple thing for us to do would be to say, oh, we're gonna hire an equity coordinator. And we would sell you on that. But that might not be the right thing. It could be that we need 0.5 of an equity coordinator, and we need professional development from people coming in. Right?
It's kind of like, it's a placeholder because, and it's a timing issue, right? Because if we didn't put money in the budget now for something next year, we would have to wait a whole other year. We would have gotten the audit in the spring, and we'd have to wait a whole other year to fund whatever it was that we decided.
You make an excellent point, but I'm nervous about adding all these people when we do not have a growing student population. I have nervous about just saying, here's $95,000.
So remember you asked me earlier to do the one page or several pages of, here's the ask, here's why we're asking it, here's how it's connected to your goals or EQS or whatever, and here's what it will be if you don't fund it. And really, these are your decisions. We are sharing with you what we believe. There's not a thing up here that any one of us on the COLT team, and I believe the administrative team, because we've been around it so many times, wouldn't say to you, we support this 100%. But we're not the ones that are going to make the final decision. You are. I hope that we explain it to you in a way, either tonight and at subsequent meetings, and by providing you with the additional information you've asked for. But I would be making it up if I said to you, oh, this is what we're going to be spending that money on, and you should be challenging me if I did that. How would I know that that's the best way to spend that money? You might decide it's worth waiting a year, and if your colleagues all agree with you, then that's what the board will do.
You will come back to us with a plan.
I won't come.
She can't have a plan until after this meeting.
I will come back to you with, for this particular ask,
Yes.
response to equity audit, I'm going to say, here's why we put it in the budget. Here's how it's connected to what the board has asked us to do and what our initiatives are. Here's what's going to happen if you don't fund it. And that's going to be, you're going to wait a year.
Okay.
And then everybody has a say about if that's what you want to
Okay,
do.
so we vote for the $95,000.
That's what it would.
We're not voting for the $95,000. We're voting for $82.5 million. And honestly, I feel like we've spent an awful lot of time tonight in the weeds on things that make up this budget, but the reality is that we're looking at an $82.5 million budget with an increase that's 2.5 times what the CPI has been, and spending about $21,000 per kid that we have in our buildings. And so, it's difficult for me to, sit here and listen to the, as we all talk about these positions, and you do not have to convince me that, making sure kids are prepared to learn when they're in the building, then you have all of these things going on. I'm just having a hard time getting past the big numbers. And so what I would like to hear in this conversation is, how are these things going to demonstrably, show progress towards the goals that we have, and how will we be measuring those in the future? And these positions that we're talking about, is this just, barely enough to keep the lights on, so to speak? Or, are we kind of building or rebuilding an infrastructure here that in future years is going to say, we'll be able to do this on a 2% budget increase because, we've stripped down in past years and we need to get back to, kind of a baseline. What are we going to look like if we pass this, 4.6% and then the voters approve a 4.6% increase? What are we going to look like next year and the following year? Are we going to be having these same conversations, or is this sort of a, kind of a one-time? And the last thing that I'll say is I've got a concern that, the governor, who has a tendency to, come out and say, well, I want, this year. And of course, he says it after the budgets have been approved and the, the votes have been warned and all that, so his timing is not great. I don't necessarily disagree with his goals, But, my concern would be, okay, we've got this 4.6% increase. A 2% increase would mean about a $1.8 million, $1.6 million budget increase, actually. And if we had to come down from 4.6, what is that going to look like? Where is that going to come from? So, like I say, I think it's a great conversation, and it's good for us to understand these things, but I think we're spending a lot of time talking about things at a level that really is not where the board should be spending its time.
I feel we are abdicating our responsibility if we do not question what our administrators have done. And not that I don't think the world of all of them. I'm constantly impressed with their skill, their knowledge, their discretion, and their abilities. But at the same time, I think that they need to sell it. They need to come in and prove it to us, that this is the right way to be spending this money. I've spent enough time in the world of education, enough time in the world of business to know that it doesn't, even the best people don't always make the best decisions.
Well, what I'd like to do, just because I'm kind of type A about this, they've gone through every position on there with the exception of the additional behavior support at HCS.
What about
the additional behavior support? If you could just maybe give us the snapshot of that, and then we can go to the bigger conversation, if that is the will of the board.
So the safe harbor restructure, we sort of talked about under the special ed budget, because it's Medicaid funded, that is providing that behavior systems coach, making sure that all of our schools have that component. And the additional behavior support for Heinsberg is I can show you, is the specialist underneath safe harbor that Heinsberg did not have before. This one. So that's what that is. And SAP resource we talked about last time, that is funded with MAC, which is Medicaid Administrative Claiming. It's the mini Medicaid amount of money. So that's where the additional SAP would come from.
Thank you.
And so Jean, maybe you could speak too, like at the bottom we have offset by, so all of these asks are offset by retirements, by a kindergarten teacher reduction based on class size, grant funding, and the net increase is $94,000 on this part of the budget, the general ed instruction part of the budget. The net increase is $94,000. You want to say anything more about that, or? Okay, thanks. Questions? Yeah.
I just want to go back to, and it's somewhere in between Russ and Ray's conversation. I just want to say one thing about the response to equity audit placeholder. I agree that we need to be cautious with adding positions. I just also want to have us think broadly that this money might be allocated in different ways that we haven't thought about, that the administration might bring back to us, such as recruitment planning. How do we recruit people of color to work in our buildings and so forth. So it might look something different and not be a long-term commitment to personnel, which I agree, as Russ is saying, we need to be thinking about or have a better understanding. Is this a one-time budget jump for us that frankly feels a little high to me? But it might not be like a trajectory that's going to go for a few years or something like that. So I just wanted to put that thought out there that that 95 might just look like something very different than a position.
Which is why I think it's that dollar amount and not a position, but it's also a pretty easy one for, I'll commit Elaine to. No, but when you come back and we get the audit back, we will have a plan before we start spending the money. So it's, and if for some reason we decide it's not 95, that we think we can achieve all our goals for 40, then you would have every right to assume that we're going to underrun the budget by 55. I mean, that would be a legitimate, carve out that we could.
Other
Thank you.
Thoughts or inputs on the budget? I said this last year, and I think it's important that if people are feeling uncomfortable, or if they have questions or concerns, I mean, now's the time to talk about it. It doesn't do any good to come on January 7th.
Well, just timing-wise, though, I would just, board, you do whatever you want, and I'm hearing a lot of discomfort with the number, a lot of support for the process and the decision-making by administration, but discomfort with the number. I totally get that. But you've only seen 2 of the 3 pieces of the budget. I would like for you to give it some thought and see the last piece of it, and we'll try to wrap it up in a bow so you can see what it's going to look like. We do have increased enrollment. We do have increased equalized pupil count, unlike much of the state. And the governor's note that came out today, the yield was very favorable. So I think you should have all pieces of information before you make a decision. That's all I would ask.
Yeah, I'm not asking anybody to make a decision.
But I would,
based on
but to
tonight.
your point, it would be good to leave the December 17th meeting with some clear direction if you want administration to start carving up a program to lower the number before the January 6th meeting.
I mean, I'll be really honest. I was very honest with the Finance Committee last night, and Jean obviously knows, and anyone who knows me from Charlotte, I'm from Charlotte, right? And we're infamous for having tough budget years, and so we tend to be really critical, and the number scares me. And it scares me that the big ads, even though it's offset, are all positions that are going to need to be funded on an ongoing basis, that are going to take that 13.2% healthcare next year, and recognizing that that increase in healthcare could really just be a one-year deal to redo the VSBIT. You know, if there was any way that we could hold off on all of these positions, you know, so that we're not incurring that additional money. It makes me nervous.
Or we need to better understand how it fits with our revenue.
Right.
I would be cautious about.
One thing that I said yesterday to the Finance Committee, that might be tough for some of us to hear, but it's realistic, is that, you know, we've set goals. And we said, this is where we want administration to go, and this is how quickly we want you to get there. If we're not comfortable with the budget, it's not just a budget. We may need to rethink our goals.
Can you be more specific, though, about what goals you're talking about? Like the budget goals that we looked at the beginning of tonight?
Well, not just the budget goals,
No,
but like, just in all the goals in general, like all of those, like I'm gonna pick on, the response to equity audit placeholder, just because that's a big one. We had a great training last year on that. You know, we all recognize that that's going to cost us money, and we all recognize it's important to our students.
And our district.
And our district. And our communities. But just this year alone, on a tough budget year, we're saying we want to put $95,000 in there to support our goals. So the administration, I don't think, is going to be able to meet our goal of that equity piece if we don't give them the tools that they need to do that.
I think maybe trying to channel sort of what you were saying earlier, Angela, but I feel like it's pulling us back to this place of trying to be clearer about the whole process and the indicators committee and tying things to the budget, because I can't clearly articulate what our goals are. I couldn't go out without a piece of paper and talking points and tell voters in my town, this is what our goals are as a budget and as a board, and this is what your budget reflects, because I think that, and I think they're too vague as we've written them to tie them to any of this specific funding. And so if we're going to want to really tie the budget and goals, I think we have to be, and I know we're in this process, but this is why we have to do it differently and much more specifically next year, so that it isn't, I'm uncomfortable with that number. Sure, we're all uncomfortable with big numbers and big spending, but I don't want to be voting on budgets based on my comfort. I want to vote based on goals and outcomes. And so if we're saying early literacy is one of the most important things, and that's going to be a determinant of so many things about our student success, and so we make that a priority, and we expect X performance or X increase. If we say it's equity and we just figure out what those indicators are, but that we need to state those things really clearly and include the indicators that are tied to them of what are the measurables going to be, whether it's measurable in a test, whether it's perception data, whether it's internal staff thing. You know, I don't think it has to be a percentage number on a test. I don't want us to get that. But I don't also want to be in a place where we're deciding budgets based on just what numbers we're comfortable with and uncomfortable with. I think it's what do those numbers mean related to a very specific goal and outcomes.
And we did have those conversations this year. I just don't think we were ready to, we just needed more time. And Angela, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you and I had a brief conversation over this. The Indicators Committee was coming up with these great goals, but it was just kind of too late in the game for us to jump onto it.
No, absolutely.
So I think we recognize that the finance and the indicators team needs to work a little bit closer to have concrete goals that we can measure from year to year.
Excuse me one second, but even as we look at this budget as a whole, and as a finance committee member, I always think it's important to keep in mind, healthcare, we have no control over healthcare.
Right.
So you can, if we back that out,
And how much
special
of
ed,
that is this?
and what we need to do, there's pieces of special ed that we have flexibility with, but there's pieces of special ed we have no flexibility with. We can back that out. So really, in that large numbered budget, specifically, where do we have flexibility? And what can we do?
Flexibility.
Is
Personnel.
$95,000.
No, it's personnel.
You decide who you hire and what positions you add. You can't change the healthcare increase, but you can decide how many people you're employing. And that does affect
But then to
healthcare.
Russ's point, we've spent an hour and a half discussing a $95,000 ask in an $80 million budget.
No, we have not.
Pretty close.
Well-
We've spent an hour and a half discussing a lot of things, but it wasn't all just 95,000.
No, I am for discussion, and I just want to remind everyone, we're taped, so hopefully there's 3 people at home watching this, and I think it's a great learning experience for people to see the
54
process.
people on Facebook.
So I have no problem discussing this, but I mean, really think about when we think about the 80 million or whatever the dollar big number is, it's really what is our budget and what are we responsible for?
In a school in Fulbright, to paraphrase William Fulbright, $100,000 here, $100,000 there, pretty soon it adds up to a lot of money.
That's bug dust. It's Bob
On
Mason's.
100, I'd say it was real money.
Is more than that. It's a big increase. It's the biggest increase in 10 years that we've looked at, and that, I think, is why it causes a bit of pause, especially when we've been going at 2.3, 2.7 to jump up. I do agree with Jean. There are a lot of unknowns yet that we don't know, but we go back to our goals, and one of our goals, I just have to keep reinforcing, is that we're doing this all at a price the community can afford. And I just think we can't forget that piece of it in the back of our heads. We all want to do what's best for kids. We all want to provide the best education and get the best outcomes and support our teachers and support our administration. But we also can't forget our community. I guess I would just put that plug in there.
Let's, we will be hearing our revenue numbers, and we will be hearing our revenue as it compares to enrollment. I think that's really helpful for this conversation. It feels a little one-sided right now, the conversation, without that.
I also, when I'm thinking about what our communities can support, I don't live in Shelburne, but I can't imagine getting up in front of the town of Shelburne and saying, you guys aren't gonna have early literacy support anymore. I can't imagine that would be accepted wholly by Shelburne. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the things that are on that list, although we're facing a very tough budget year, I guess. I think they're all things, to be honest, and I'm sorry, Adam, but last night in the budget committee, I was really like, do we really need a CVU leadership? Do we really need CVU guidance? I can't get over how many gym teachers I think there must be in this school. But then after hearing what Adam's talking about, it doesn't really seem like it's working the way that it is. And do we want to leave it that way? Do we want to leave the school that way? Do we want to leave our kids that way? So I guess, and if I were a voter, if I knew that meant we don't get this, I am a voter, you're right. But a voter that is not privy to, they can be privy to all this information. But I mean, if I had a kiddo like at CVU, or a kid that could go through CVU or has gone through CVU, or I just want to know that the next generation is well equipped, I don't know that I would be okay with us not fixing a problem that's been identified. I think a lot of it comes out to how we communicate it to our communities.
So we have,
In
summary,
we did go back and we didn't ask to put the board goals up front, and I'm happy that she did that, but in my mind, when I was telling the story, I wanted to tell the story and bring it back too, so now reflect, do you think that we hit those things that we said, yes, they are very general, Erin, I'm looking forward to the new process that you will start with your retreat, but I think that like, we were honest about looking at what your goals are, and then thinking about our own initiatives that are part of yours, implement these key initiatives, and charges that you've given to us, and this is what this budget reflects. And for the instructional program budget, it's up. Is that a total 4.6%?
4.6 is the salary benefits within the box, but the total is 4.6%, including special ed and the healthcare increase.
Right.
And that is, it's 3.9% at the cost per equalized pupil, we think.
3.9 at equalized people?
Cost, yes.
So I took a lot of notes. I know I've got some deliverables before the next meeting on some things, and we'll get that to you.
So I have one question. So as we've already stated, salaries and benefits drive the lion's share of
Right.
our budget each year. And we've talked about the positions that are being proposed, and I have really appreciated the context that has come along with that, because it helps me determine whether or not I can support those positions or not. But what I'm not hearing is, beyond retirements that we can do some planning for, et cetera, does it feel like within every school there's a robust examination of each position that exists and a determination if that position is still absolutely essential? And I'm wondering about that process in terms of looking at the existing workforce and what kind of examination goes on position by position to ensure that those positions are absolutely necessary.
So at the K-8s, you're talking mostly about classroom teacher positions and the intervention framework. So I would say yes in both counts, because we really do a deep scrub of, here are the teachers at this grade level, this is what this is going to mean, here are the supports for those teachers at the different grade levels, and we have lots of conversations about like, what's needed? Do you have what you need to support the school? So I think that that does happen. It doesn't mean that we're not opportunistic. There could be something that we would change if, person were to retire. Whenever somebody retires in not a classroom position, but in another position, it gives you the opportunity to say, do I want to rehire that same position, or is there something else that we might do with this? But I think at the K-8s, yes, it's much more complicated at the high school, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really way more
But to Elaine's point,
complicated.
that's why we went through all of the equity issues, because those are people. Those are, right? And that's what we're looking at, and you can decide that. I'm not educated. I can't tell you if we have enough art. I can tell you it's equal, right? So whether or not we have too much art or not gets into the EQS standards and things like that. But I've always been impressed that this really is a bottoms-up budget. We actually look at all the positions. We know we accelerate the salary year to year by person, right? It's very much at that level. So when you look at classroom teachers, at EA teachers, it looks at all the teachers. We showed you administrators, we showed you nurses, we showed you librarians. If there aren't a handful of positions that you didn't see today. So flip through it again and see if there's somebody that's missing, aside from paras, which we did last year, but we didn't do this year, I think. I would say that you saw all the positions, all the educational positions today. And so that's what I always think of as doing the bottoms-up scrub.
And it starts with the principals at the local level, sitting down with blank sheets of paper and saying, okay, let's start going through this.
And I certainly trust that our principals are doing this. It's just
Yeah.
helpful to hear directly about this process, because I know you're examining every aspect of the budget, but it feels like in any employment entity,
Right.
from year to year, that's an important question to be
Just
asking.
ask, right.
You know,
Yeah.
so, thanks.
Okay. Anything else?
Thank you very much. I lost my agenda. I think we're ready to adjourn.
Actually, can I just mention one thing? We did get it's very short, we did get the tax commissioner's letter, came out a couple of hours ago.
Sent you all a copy of it,
Right.
hot off the press.
And what that does is the tax commissioner sets a yield. He never doesn't set it. He puts one out there. The legislature won't set the yield until May, but this is the yield that we will use in our calculations. The yield is roughly, think of it conceptually as the cost per equalized pupil you could afford if the tax rate, if property tax rate was $1. Now, it's way more complicated. If you want to go to this, VSBA has a really good short video if you want more on it, but think of it that way. So because property values have gone up across the state, the yield, let's just say it got better for us. So it's a built-in help for that 3.9. It's going to come down pretty substantially, I think about 3.5 cents. It's pretty good. So I'll have those numbers for you just sort of conceptually so you can see them next week, but it was out. The other thing that comes out with the tax commissioner's letter is usually a letter from the governor. Who was Susan? Who sent the letter out, actually?
Susan Young.
Yeah. And this has been other times where the governor has come out and signaled what he intends to do about this outrageous education bill. I'd say it was sort of, yes, this is too high and it should come down. It wasn't as specific as it's been in other years, so that's kind of a hold your breath and see what he's going to do.
1.9%?
next.
Yeah, I'm going to see how that happens.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he thought everyone should hold their increases to 1.9%, which is pretty tough to do when you have 13.2% in healthcare to deal with. So, so anyways, it came out. If Lynn sent it to you, if you have any questions, shoot it my way.
I just checked my email again.
Did anyone else?
You
Not
sent
get
it
it?
to the other board.
I sent it to the other board.
Her ghost board.
She's like, I sent other board.
Yeah.
Navy basketball team got it.
Anyways, just wanted to get out there because we talk about yield because it's supposed to come out in the first. It came out today, so I didn't have a chance to put it on slides for you. But
I will send it again, but not from here because apparently that one doesn't work either. So I will do it when I get home.
now I'm done.
All right. Just a quick reminder, so our next budget meeting is December 17th, 6 p.m. here. And then we'll meet again January 7th, and the 21st of January is when we will approve the budget. If you have a committee meeting between now and then, please let Jane know. Committee people, HR indicators. Brendan.
And just for your planning hats, we did hire Dor Whittier as the architect to look at Charlotte for us. They're starting to do some conceptual work for us, and we're still marching towards a timeline of asking you to support asking the community for a bond in March, which means that probably not until the 21st, but on the 21st when we're just approving the warnings, will probably be the time also that Dor Whittier will come and we'll have a conversation about what that might look like in Charlotte. Okay.
Good-oak. Motion to adjourn.
Wait, one question here.
Okay,
So
sorry.
you just hired an architect in early December to give you a cost estimate for a
Yeah, now-
bond that you want to ask for?
We'll talk about that on the 21st.
No,
okay?
no, no. No, no.
Okay,
No.
so let me
No,
back
wait, could I finish my thought before you interrupt me?
I suppose.
So we need to warn that and to get it printed in late January.
On the 21st.
Okay. So they're gonna present multiple rounds of cost-reduced trade studies, and you're gonna make that decision in 1 month and
Is there a question?
19 days?
Can I explain now, or you tell me when you're done?
I think that's highly
Okay.
unrealistic.
All right, so, and it may not happen. The thing we have laid out is Dora Whittier has worked with Charlotte over the last decade on several different options, and they just haven't gotten to doing the bigger one. Jeff, you can back me up on this. And remember, this is not gonna be a $9.75 million bond. It's going to be a phased approach over multiple years, because as I've heard from this board, we want to get away from the $10 million bond. We want to get to spaced out smaller bonds. So this is going to be the first section. It's badly needed infrastructure, HVAC, that kind of thing, electrical upgrades, sprinklers, that kind of thing that Dora Whittier believes that they can have a reasonable number for that on the 21st.
I support phased approaches. It worked very well in Heinsberg.
It did, yeah.
And I have to say, their presentation to us, the amount of detail that they came with based on the history they've had at Charlotte was so incredibly impressive, and it was helpful because we interviewed 3 different architectural firms. I mean, they're ready to dive in, but they come with so much data already. They know that school really inside and out.
They did our work on back in 2008 through 10. They did a big feasibility study for us, so, yeah.
I think this is a bit of an unusual situation because this firm does have such history with this school. I think in general this would feel very odd, but I know that Jean has been very keenly on top of this time frame and very loud and clear with us about how we need to stay to a schedule to amass this information so that it can be brought forward on time.
And it would be a finite project, and if there were additional phases, it would require additional votes subsequent years.
Right.
So it could be whatever this phase is and done, right?
Conversely, if this gets shot down on January 21st, we're looking at a different election.
A November vote or something.
To
Yep.
cast a vote on it.
I appreciate bringing it to the board for the conversation, but I hear you too.
Okay, any other surprises anyone wants to spring up? More money people want to spend? Okay, then, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
And we are adjourned.